Final Fantasy XVI's world is built around Square's idea of Game of Thrones. Clive, our protagonist, is essentially Jon Snow. It's hard to not compare as he looks a lot like him. They both even have wolves for pets and end up in a pretty similar situation. In fact, almost everyone has a doppelganger. There's a Night King and a Hodor, as well as a Cersei and a Jaime. It's all a bit too on the hands. Except one prominent figure is notably missing from this story, Daenerys. Not that this story needs a fierce dragon queen, but I do find it interesting that they left out one of the most popular characters of the story. Now, I have no qualms about Square imitating Game of Thrones, but it's more about how badly they've reimagined it. Square wishes its characters and story were half as interesting as their inspirations. Nearly every personality presented feels so one-dimensional that they'd probably be more entertaining if they were as silent as Link. Beyond that, too many characters are just unbelievably conflict-adverse with each other.
I have to do this, whatever the cost.
All right.
Then when some kind of conflict between characters finally does arise, it feels like it came out of nowhere. It serves no purpose beyond shock value or an attempt at subverting your expectations. Even worse is that these contrived conflicts are often resolved within the same cutscene they show up, leaving this sense that everything feels a bit too perfect all of the time, even though it seems like their lives are in shambles and that the world is supposedly ending. But I'm getting ahead of myself and I'll go into more detail later. But despite how boring I found this amusement park to be, what makes 16 so interesting is that when the main character gives up on doing their best Jon Snow impression, and the game instead reflects what the series has historically done best, it shines brighter than nearly any other game that I've ever played. Although these sections of the game are far and few in between, sitting at the apex of each of these rides presents a view that is nearly unmatched. I find that these completely contrasting feelings on how good 16 can be makes it really interesting to talk about, because it's all too obvious that Square has no idea what makes Game of Thrones intriguing. But they perfectly understand what makes Dragon Ball Z so cool. Some of these fights are so close to being perfect that I would probably rate some of them as 99 out of 100. That's how good we're talking. So I think this is a great opportunity to take a look at both sides of the situation and understand why some of these experiences are miserable and why others are so incredible. How did Square fail at imitating R.R. Martin and in the same game create some of the most spectacular and entertaining battles the series has ever had? From here on out, I'll spoil everything that makes this game good and bad, as well as much of Game of Thrones, partly because it feels impossible to properly talk about this game without mentioning it. So if you haven't played 16 or somehow have not yet seen Game of Thrones, now would be a great time to stop and come back once you've done one or both. Overall, this game is tough for me to recommend. What I can say is that if you enjoyed Final Fantasy XIV, you'll probably like this game. If it's not obvious already, outside of the rating in Final Fantasy XIV, that game was not for me. I don't think Final Fantasy XIV is a good experience from start to finish, mostly because of how excruciatingly boring the first 60 hours are. But I know there's a ton of people that love Final Fantasy XIV and 16 despite their flaws, so don't take my opinion at face value if you do like those things, or honestly, just in general be sure to form your own opinion. I'm just here to serve as a reference and entertainment. So back to the question at hand, when 16 is at its best, why is it fun? First of all, I think it's important to recognize that the combat in 16 is well done, and dare I say it, fun, eventually anyways. The game slowly trickles out its combat systems over time, meaning players with any amount of experience in action games are going to be a little bored before you have access to more abilities and combos. To put it plainly, the start of the game kind of feels like a one-button mashing sim, which can be fun in the right context. I mean, people love Cookie Clicker. Anyways, after around 4 to 6 hours of gameplay, the combat systems finally settle in. They become complex enough for it to be fun to play around with. Not as complex as Cookie Clicker, of course, but enough to be fun. I should mention now that this is squarely an action game. Don't let the title or other certain RPG-looking elements fool you, although there is a talent tree. Anyways, we'll talk about this more in depth later, but for now, think of it solely as an action-adventure game rather than an action RPG. I only have one real complaint with the combat, and that's that there is a lack of more difficult fights. While there are a few fights that offer the challenge I was looking for, they are only this way if approached far under-leveled or with restrictions set on yourself such as not upgrading your weapon or not using potions. Although I should be clear that wanting more of a challenge is a praise to the combat and not a criticism. While I would like the game to push me around a bit more, I know that's not for everyone, so it's more of a taste thing than a bad thing. The point is that I think the combat is fun enough that it could support more interesting challenges. Okay, whatever, so you wanted the game to be a bit tougher, but what exactly about the combat makes it fun to play? Why do I like it? First of all, it's a very fluid action experience, much like a Devil May Cry or Bayonetta system. Although the combos aren't nearly as diverse or have as much depth as these games, they still feel good to play with. But this isn't a problem because I don't think 16 needs more combo depth. In fact, I think more combo depth may have been detrimental to the experience, because the game is meant to be more of a hybrid action combat game with parries and dodges. Now, I would never consider 16 to be a Souls-like, but it's clear it has certainly taken some inspiration like the rest of the games industry. That said, my largest praise for this game's combat is that it's the kind of hybrid action game I've been wanting to play since Sekiro. Although the combat isn't as tight or difficult as Sekiro, it's still about as fluid and fun in its foundations, with the goal of combat being juggling your combos and abilities while also avoiding enemy attacks. I think Square does a fantastic job of giving you the necessary tools to supplement this flavor of combat. Here's the setup. You've got your typical basic attack, a dodge, a jump, and a spell. These actions make up the foundations of 16's combat. These can be then mixed together to create different combos that can be as simple as attacking and then using a spell, which changes the attack you'll do into something new. For instance, using your basic attack and then a spell attack immediately after will cause you to do a frontal blast of magic instead of shooting a fireball. Combos like these are then given further complexity and options once you unlock more abilities, eventually evolving your gameplay into chaining several different abilities together that can be personally tailored for the situation. You'll go from simply hitting and dodging to weaving in all kinds of different abilities while also still dodging. But it looks a lot cooler now. It also feels really good to do, and honestly that's probably what's most important in a combat system like this. One tiny complaint is that there is quite a bit of enemy repetition, so once you learn the most effective way to deal with them, it may start to feel a bit stale. But the bosses tend to be fairly unique, so given this kind of complexity, the decision making and interactions you make during these boss fights stays pretty fresh in each new encounter. And one of the keys here that really makes 16's combat enjoyable for me is that you can dodge out of almost any attack. You won't find the same kind of commitment to your swings that a typical Souls game has, which is why I liken it a bit more to Sekiro and how it feels to play. And I find this kind of fluidness to be a very satisfying way to play when done correctly like it is here. And where combat truly shines are in what I previously mentioned as the roller coasters of 16, which are these giant kaiju Godzilla type battles that happen throughout the game. I find that these are by far the most fun parts of 16, and what makes them beyond impressive is how cleanly they implement the combat system you use with Clive and then transfer it to the Eikon battles. These battles mirror the same fundamentals that 16 teaches you when playing as Clive, except everything is now a bit more dramatic with increasing flair and explosiveness. When playing as Ifrit, the icon Clive transforms into, your basic actions are mostly the same. You can still dodge, jump, attack, and toss a fireball, and of course you can then combo these moves together. And this includes the abilities you learn around Clive's initial tree, like doing a dash attack, double jump, and an air slam. What makes playing Ifrit so fun is that despite how similar it is to playing Clive on paper, it feels completely different. There's an obvious change in weight, attacks feel more committed, slower, heavier, and stronger. And they certainly show you just how strong by multiplying the damage you do by 100. All of this immersing you further into the experience of being Ifrit. And then Square goes above and beyond with the scale, the animations, the length, and the buildup of each of these larger-than-life encounters. While these are well-designed and complete experiences, it's the extra icing they put on top that really brings these spectacles to the next level, making these some of the best moments I've ever had in a game. Simply, these Eikon battles are incredible, and I can hardly believe that they exist in this game of all places. But after all is said and done, this is still a Final Fantasy game. If there's anything you can expect from Square in the past 3 decades, it's that there will be amazing spectacles in your Final Fantasy game. Considering that fact, it's no small achievement that these experiences in 16 is Final Fantasy at its pinnacle. Maybe even more astounding is how they kept increasing the stakes from one fight to the next. Because each Eikon fight was so good, I continually had absurd expectations for the next one, and somehow I never felt let down. Maybe part of this is that each Eikon encounter gives you new abilities to use as Ifrit and features a grander arena than the last. From fighting Garuda in some basic open plains to eventually combining with another Eikon fusion hostile to face off with a giant laser dragon in space, and then pushing against those laser beams in true Dragon Ball Z fashion, only then to be able to instantly teleport behind the enemy and shoot your own Kamehameha laser. And while all of these are pretty great, I do have a favorite, which is the duel with Titan. For a fight with the largest of the Eikons, it starts as a pretty modest boxing match, with the two of you matching blows until Titan finally falls. But these fights always continue to build, and somehow always over-deliver, so I knew it wasn't over just yet. As Titan becomes desperate to overcome Ifrit, he eats a magic crystal which, for whatever reason, transforms him into an even more gigantic beast that is as large as your mom. I mean, a mountain. I'm only saying this next part because of how much I'm going to criticize the story later, but I'm willing to overlook the absurdity of the situation because the outcome is actually interesting and serves a purpose for the spectacle. Although it does make me question a few things later, like why couldn't we have just eaten a crystal to become a giant Ifrit to take on Titan, or Ultima? I don't know, but it's cool, so I'll let it slide for now. And while this part is awesome, I found the music to be a bit jarring at first. It didn't really ring with me right away, probably because it didn't feel like it fits in with the rest of the game. But it wasn't long until it brought me back to Xanarkand when Sin was dismantling the city and Auron shows up to save Titus. That's when I started to dig it, although it does feel weird that I sort of had to disconnect myself from the overall game to enjoy it, or even rely on nostalgia. But maybe if this wasn't the only time we got this kind of music, it would have worked well more immediately. Just kind of another reason that the context of the theme park matters. Anyways, besides that, this is peak Final Fantasy for me. The only thing that could have made it even better is if the Sonic-like section had boost pads and ramps so you could really fly a Titan in style. Something I found really strange was that I didn't mind the QuickTime events in this section, because I normally hate them. Shocking, I know, and I would even concede that they enhanced the experience and made me feel a little more a part of the action, which to my surprise gave me a revelation about QuickTime events. It's not that they are bad, it's just how and when they are used. For example, the game will ask you to hold down right trigger to open doors and kick down wooden gates. I hated every single one of these, except for this one.
They never stood a chance.
You're welcome.
Other than that, they never felt like they were worth the time. I think nearly every one of these moments would have been better if it had not included the QuickTime event and let me chop it down with my sword instead. So if the overall experience is bad, QuickTime events will probably make that situation even worse, especially if you aren't immersed. But when the experience is good, then surprisingly, they can enhance that moment if done well. All of this only further cemented how well done these fights are. They are so fun that I liked doing the QuickTime events. I would even shout it from the rooftops. QuickTime events can be good if done correctly, and a part of what makes this engaging is that you already know they're coming. We've been primed to do these throughout the rest of the game, so this builds a certain amount of anticipation when you are already prepared to press whatever it prompts you. I was also impressed that these QuickTime events do change what happens in the fight. Failing a QuickTime event will actually play a different cutscene and will typically even damage you. So all in all, these Eikon fights are tons of fun. With these, Square creates some of the best moments I've ever experienced in a game, with ups, downs, anticipation, loops, and decent endings that ties up the situation. It's amazing to me that Square was able to make a fight where I run up a giant rock and punch it to death, one of my favorite moments in a game. Square made me say, damn, that was cool after punching a rock. So being cool in context is really what this boils down to. And I want to make sure this comes across because it's kind of the entire point. Let's try to look at this fight without anything I've shown so far and see what's happening here. In this moment, it's hard to look at anything besides this giant boulder on your screen. So you could simplify this section of the fight to be the player, a living rock of fire, is mindlessly smashing the attack button against a much larger rock that is not on fire. I mean, that's not the coolest or most exciting thing, right? But you have to remember what led to this point. All I know is that when I see some dude running sideways up a rock, shooting other rocks flying at him from the sky with fireballs, and then seamlessly jumping to another rock tentacle and punching that giant rock man, I think, damn, that was cool. So it doesn't matter how simple the combat in this section is. When I'm smashing the X button and I have a good reason as to why, it's cool. You don't have to care that it's a rock you're punching, all you need is a reason to want to break it. And after enough punches, you will break it. The other fights aren't too different. There's a section where you're just a bird spitting at another bird, and then you press the same button over and over. But eventually you're moving so fast that you can blink behind them and shoot a laser beam in their back. The point here again is that Square Enix understands what makes something cool. Because when we really break down the actual gameplay of these sections, it's seemingly not that interesting. Simply what makes roller coasters so good is the entirety of the experience. This is why Square is so successful when creating these Eikon battles. They knew every detail mattered here, and they delivered. But when it came to building out the entirety of the theme park surrounding these moments, Square ended up setting my attention to zero. Nothing felt like it mattered. Again, it's just too obvious that they have no idea why Game of Thrones is so interesting.
But are we truly safe here in the Agora?
The city guard have been paid, if that's what you're implying.
Clearly, they liked it enough to build an entire video game world out of the idea, but didn't come to know it in the same way they did Dragon Ball Z. And I think if we've learned anything from the Eikon battles, it's that giving the player a reason to be engaged is of the utmost importance. And being able to create those reasons to be engaged comes from an understanding of that thing. So unfortunately, now is the time to go over the rest of the game. This is unfortunate because I'm about to do a lot of complaining about how these experiences bored me to death. If they had not, I think it would have lifted up the entire game by a massive amount. It likely would have made the already fantastic parts even better. Like, what if you wanted to punch that rock even more badly? Seriously. Because no, I don't think you need to bore the player, or more specifically me, to death in order to give the Eikon fights the highs they do. But it starts with creating interesting characters and a plot that holds your attention. And this might come to a surprise to you considering how much I've disparaged them so far, but I do think Square set up good foundations for the characters and even the plot of this game. But they squandered them by not properly playing them out. But before we dive too deep into that, let's do a quick story summary. A quick recap for those who have played the game but are maybe hazy on some details, and of course for those who have no idea what's going on or what a Clive is. All in all, we'll get a better idea of who these characters are and what their story is, so we can look at it all with a little more scrutiny. We first meet our protagonist Clive as some dude on a scouting mission, and then not long after as a young adult prince in the kingdom of Rosaria. He is the firstborn child, but not heir to the throne. The succession has instead fallen to his younger brother Joshua, because Clive was unable to gain a special power called the Eikon. You know, those giant things that made the fights cool as heck. This is also alternatively known as being a dominant. And now that Joshua has the Eikon, he can use powerful fire magic and turn into his Eikon the Phoenix. Because Clive was unable to wield this power, he has instead dedicated his life to be a part of the Shields, which is a special unit of soldiers meant to guard the royal family. He finds purpose in life by swearing to protect his dear brother Joshua, no matter the cost. For whatever reason, his mother finds that this makes her look bad, and she despises him for not being able to wield the Eikon. One of our first tasks of the game as Clive is escorting Joshua to a ritual site called Phoenix Gate, with the goal being to commune further with the Phoenix, or something like that. Anyways, before leaving, Clive shares a somewhat intimate moment with a ward of the Rosaria Kingdom, Jill. They appear to have a somewhat close relationship, but that is left up in the air at this point. They talk about how they both desire lasting peace, but are not hopeful since war seems to be on the horizon. Clive then almost reaches to comfort her before saying, "It's cold and we should go inside and head to bed." And then he stays outside by himself anyways. What a charmer. The next day, Clive, Joshua, and their father, the king, start their journey towards the ritual site. Not long after arriving at Phoenix Gate, they are then ambushed by an enemy squadron and much of the army escorting Joshua has been taken out. Clive and Joshua fight their way through, but just as Joshua and the king are about to escape, the king is assassinated. This makes Joshua wail in terror and begin to transform into his Eikon in a fit of rage. Meanwhile, from our perspective, Clive sees Joshua in the form of the Phoenix, then he sees a strange man on fire, and then he passes out. After this wild turn of events, out of nowhere, another Eikon, Ifrit, shows up and attacks the Phoenix. We have a whole battle here, and it seems like Ifrit kills the Phoenix. And then, in the aftermath of this battle, everyone is seemingly dead except for Clive. Clive's mom then shows up with some escorts and finds him among the ruins. Then she almost has him killed, but decides to ship him off as a part of her army as a slave. Wow, what a mom. Then we learn she was the one behind the assassination plot. Then we're given a 13-year time skip, which reunites us with our much more rugged and tougher looking Clive, who is on a scouting mission to capture another kingdom's dominant. Things aren't going well as a couple of other dominants are fighting and absolutely ravaging the land apart. Still, they persist and end up finding the dominant they were tasked to capture. They fight and capture her only for Clive to realize that this dominant of ice is actually Jill. So now instead of completing the job, he decides to rid himself of the rest of his crew so he can run away with Jill. But it isn't too long before the rest of the army catches up with him. When Clive and Jill seem to be cornered and doomed, a bolt of lightning clashes down on their pursuers, and suddenly enters Sid, the dominant of lightning. He was searching for Jill and also just happens to know exactly who Clive is. Sid also happens to have Clive's childhood dog, Torgal, with him. Sid is also running a place for dominants and slaves to be free from the chains of society. He's dedicated his life to creating a place where people can choose how they die. Now that Clive is a little more free, he decides to dedicate his life to getting revenge on the man who killed his brother. Sid seems to have a lot of info on dominants and other people's whereabouts, so Clive seems ready to help out for the cause where he can while Jill recovers and he can get more information. Eventually, Sid and Clive hear rumors of a dominant of fire running around, potentially Ifrit, so they decide to pursue this case and learn they are being kept captive by the dominant of wind, Benedicta. Benedicta seems to have some kind of relationship with Sid, as well as some of the other dominants including Titan and Odin. She out there. Anyways, they eventually corner her, but the potential dominant of fire and whoever else they're with have escaped. She gets away as well and then transforms into her Eikon, Garuda. Meanwhile, Clive meets a hooded man that seems to be following him around and trying to lead him places. This hooded figure then leads us towards Garuda, where Clive and her clash, and then he suddenly turns into Ifrit, making Clive realize that he was actually the other dominant of fire, Ifrit, all along. And just before this, we also learned that he can suck up the power of other dominant. Anyways, since Clive saw Ifrit kill his brother at Phoenix Gate, he now believes himself to be the one who killed his brother. This puts Clive in a state of emotional turmoil. Clive eventually stops losing his shit and decides to find Sid to get answers. Gav, a scout of Sid's, is certain that he saw another Eikon of fire, so it seems possible that he could maybe not be the culprit, so Clive decides to discover the whole truth of the hooded man before ending things. And eventually, Clive also decides to help Sid in his quest to make the hideaway a better place and free the slaves. Except Clive says he wants to help people not only choose how they die, but also how they live. Wow, how touching, Clive. Anyways, Sid's plan is to rid the world of all the mother crystals. He comes to the realization that these crystals are the source of the blight in the world. Mother crystals themselves are mountain-sized and can be harvested to create smaller crystals, which grant power to use magic to a specific kind of person. These people are literally then branded, which appears as a tattoo on their face, and sold off as slaves because they can use these crystals, which basically allows them to use magic and only them. They are typically used for tasks as mundane as watering plants, getting water from the well, and being a human toaster or refrigerator. It's ridiculous. Seriously, there's a guy who refrigerates some dude's fish for like 5 years. I have to interrupt here because I still cannot stand how just unbelievable it is that the people being used as slaves are the only ones that can use magic besides dominance. Anyways, Cid's plan is that if they destroy all the mother crystals, the blight will stop spreading, as well as the branded will basically be the same as anyone else because there will be no more magic crystals. And eventually, we do end up on a mission to destroy a mother crystal, but then some dude called Ultima comes out of it and calls Clive Mythos. We have an epic fight with him. And then Cid dies saving Clive from Ultima. Then Ultima shows up again, still alive somehow, and Clive is knocked out. But this time Joshua is here to save the day, out of nowhere. He was alive the whole time, wooey woo wow. Joshua sucks up Ultima into his chest and then leaves behind a phoenix feather on Clive. Then we get another forward jump in time of 5 years this time. So yeah, that was a lot. And this is where the story really starts to become a mess and is unfortunately what the rest of the plot is based on. And we'll get into more details soon. But first off, killing off Cid was probably 16's worst mistake. Cid is quite honestly the one good character this game had. Not only that, but Cid being around made every other character he interacted with better. Especially Clive. Cid would actually challenge Clive and his morals and his feelings. On top of that, the little squabbles and jokes they had made them feel like real characters. Clive is just too serious and boring with every other character in the game, and it's especially true after Cid dies. So I can only wonder why 16 killed off its only good character. Maybe because Game of Thrones kills off good characters, so we should too? Who knows, maybe they thought it would be a great heartbreaking moment. Well, it was, and it also just made me even more bored for the next 30 hours of the game. Anyways, bringing it back to the current story, Clive becomes the new Cid, and it kind of works because he sucks up Cid's power and can now use lightning magic. Anyways, the main plot becomes grow the hideaway, save the slaves, destroy all mother crystals, and maybe do something about Ultima. Everything leading up to this point is not that bad. I was at least interested and excited about what was going to happen until the second time skip. The characters have interesting issues and dynamic relationships. Sure, there's a few problems with the setup, but they're salvageable. I think each character has enough dimensions to make some interesting conflict and resolutions happen here. And the plot had enough going on that it had me curious as to what would happen next. 16 laid down good foundations for their story. This brings us back to the world building, or the context this game exists in. Much of the game's plot and world is centered around the fact that there are slaves. Anyone who is born with the ability to use magic is branded with a tattoo on their face and sold off to be used for tedious labor. This is one of the main problems that Cid and Clive want to solve in 16. Obviously a great goal to have. But the problem this plot has is that the people who become slaves are chosen because they are the only people who can use magic. The first thing you might consider as a flaw in the scenario is that if every slave can use magic and almost no one else can besides the Eikons, then why in the world would they not band together and rebel? Well, they do allude to the idea that it can't happen because the branded eventually succumb to a curse that petrifies them, which is caused from using magic. But this doesn't seem to happen so quickly that they wouldn't be able to organize a revolution. And almost all of the petrified people we meet in-game are elderly and seemingly on their last legs. So not only does this whole concept feel flimsy, but you might also then think, wouldn't they miss a few people? Like surely there are people out in the world who can use magic and don't become branded. You would think some kind of rebel group like that might prop up. The closest thing we get is the hideaway, but just about everyone there is branded, a dominant, or just there to help out. Something you'll probably have noticed by now is that Clive gets a brand of his own after the Phoenix Gate fiasco. And because of this, nearly everyone we meet outside of the hideaway treats us like we are human garbage.
You want something, you come back with your master. I won't sell to some stray branded.
It's a bit heavy-handed, but it's not totally out of line with the system they've set up. It gets the point across pretty effectively. If you're branded, people hate you. But after the second time skip, Clive noticeably has had his brand removed, but a giant mark on his face remains in place of it. Yet everyone treats him like a normal person now. The problem I have here is that the mark left behind makes it all too clear that any person who has had this operation done was previously branded. Seriously, the scar left behind is so obviously in the shape of a brand and no one ever mentions it.
Must have been my double.
Again, people in this game treat the branded as if every single one of them killed their mom. So it's just totally unbelievable that they would treat someone with a scar in the exact shape and location of a brand as a normal person. Moments like this are what make Final Fantasy XVI feel fake. The unbelievability of their world ruins any kind of potential immersion, leaving you less connected and instead questioning how is this possible in the worst of ways.
The boy I carried for 9 long moons. A bloody bearer.
Oh, you poor thing. You gave it to the constables then?
Just left it at the garrison, Let them deal with it.
Now, this isn't to say everything about the world and story is done poorly. There are moments where I felt engaged and immersed. For example, there's a section early on where you get to play as Joshua. Even though this is unfortunately the only time you get to play as someone other than Clive, it's well done. And the reason they have you play as Joshua here is to show off the power of the Eikons. This child is healing people for 10 extra HP bar and damaging them for the same with fireballs. It lets you understand how all these soldiers die while somehow Joshua makes it out alive despite being the target of this raid and a literal child. Imagine if Clive had that kind of power. Guess that's why his mom hates him. This power disparity is amplified even further when you play as Clive again. The next fight is against a slightly stronger dude, but it takes you like 4 minutes to take him down. Talk about weak. My point here is that this is the ludonarrative harmony that Final Fantasy XVI was capable of the entire time. It showed me that somewhere in Square people are properly designing interactions and stories that can cohesively fit together, that also don't feel fake. And not seeing anything like this again, besides the Eikon fights, was shocking. As to why the rest of the game lacked this kind of proper storytelling, we'll never know. If I had to guess though, it's probably the usual suspects: crunch, budget cuts, and too many cooks in the kitchen. I should say that 16 continually has good potential in its setup. The problem is that most of it feels meaningless or forgotten about by the end. There's a lot of examples of this throughout the game, where there's some sort of conflict that you think the character will have to resolve, but ultimately it has no resolution, such as Mid's issues with her father Sid, Jill and Clive's relationship, the effect of Sid's death on the main characters and the hideaway, Joshua never approaching Clive to let him know he's alive, and more. It's almost impressive how many interesting setups they have, but make all of them out to be totally mundane or simply unresolved. One of these that I would like to focus on is the interaction between Joshua and Clive at Phoenix Gate. You know that one part where Clive thinks he killed Joshua. Clive sees his brother transforming from a distance, and then we see Clive himself transform. Although the player doesn't know that's the case in the moment, but it seems at least plausible that's what's going on. Yet, what then diverts your thoughts from this being the case is that the other Eikon starts fighting Joshua. And why would Clive want to fight Josh when he has made it his whole life's purpose to protect him? Now, I think these questions could have been answered in some various ways that would have made sense. For example, maybe Clive was holding some kind of underlying resentment towards his brother for being chosen as the Phoenix instead of himself. I think this would have been an easy and interesting way to develop his character. But instead we later find out no, he simply blacked out and had no control over his power. So then the only thing left for Clive to resolve is that he has to contend with the idea that he was the one who killed his brother. The game does go over this, and it is an interesting conflict to focus on, but ultimately it doesn't lead to anything because Clive discovers that Joshua was alive and he didn't actually kill him. Now, it could have led to something in Clive's character development because the next logical step would be that he has to contend with the idea that he tried to kill his brother, but it's never brought up. After Clive learns that Joshua was alive the whole time, this entire thing that was eating him up inside just vanishes. It's like it never happened. Which is not only boring, but it's also unbelievable. That kind of grief and turmoil just doesn't go away like that. On top of that, it also makes me wonder what was even the point of going down this line if you aren't going to explore it any further. The characters in this game never question anything that's going on with them or anyone else. Like, shouldn't Clive have wondered even a little why his Eikon tried to kill his brother? Or feel like it was his fault still? Or even other things in life such as his mom literally having her entire family ordered to be assassinated. In fact, no one says anything about this until they randomly run into her, and then she speedruns an explanation of why she did everything, which again makes it feel fake. I'm probably going to say that a lot. There are so many situations that have the potential to be really interesting for both the plot and the development of Joshua and Clive's characters. Instead, they're all almost used exclusively for the plot. I guess this one about Joshua makes you think he's dead so they can do a little surprise reveal later, but even that didn't really surprise me. I knew Joshua was alive the entire time. Back to Clive thrashing his brother, even from this cutscene, it's unclear whether or not Josh truly died. I mean, personally, I was almost certain Josh hadn't died because he is the Phoenix. You know, the one mythical animal that gets reborn from the ashes? The Phoenix Down, one of the most important items in nearly every Final Fantasy game that revives party members from the brink of death. I mean, come on. The only person who thought Josh was dead was Clive because he never played a Final Fantasy game. But even though I was like 99% certain Joshua wasn't dead, they hadn't revealed that to us just yet. So there was still a chance for him to be dead. But then they go ahead and just show him being alive super early on, like just out of nowhere without reason. Meanwhile, Clive is still agonizing over his death, and even worse, when he starts to believe he killed his brother, we already know it's not true. Like, if Benedicta has captured someone who they thought was Ifrit, but you're Ifrit, then who the heck did they capture? A third dominant of fire? They bring this up, but don't really think about it too much. Now, it's not that things like we know but the character doesn't know type of things can't work in stories, but the use of it here is particularly bad because it doesn't serve any purpose for us to know. I don't find that it benefits the plot in any way or makes it more entertaining. In fact, you could even consider that it makes the story worse. The scene where Joshua comes to save Clive from Ultima feels far less dramatic because of it. This would have been a great time to reveal he's alive. I've probably been like, oh shit, Joshua is alive and here. I might have still complained that it's a bit convenient, but it's at least more entertaining. Instead, I was like, oh looky, Joshua finally decided to show up. This whole thing with Joshua being fake dead feels like Square was shooting for a parallel here in Game of Thrones, where Jon Snow is on the wall while his brothers have died to Theon in Winterfell. This works in Game of Thrones because there is a whole story told from Bran's side that is incredibly important to the plot and sort of requires that they are thought to be dead. Joshua being out on his own does next to nothing to serve the plot. We are eventually told that Joshua is looking for information on the Night King, Ultima, but this could have been totally removed from the plot and everything would have stayed the same. In the end, it was pointless. At least Bran got superpowers from his journey. So maybe instead of trying to copy the plot of Game of Thrones, they could have created their story more based in character interactions. Maybe it would have been far more interesting if Joshua was alive but looking for revenge on Clive for trying to murder him. Like Joshua somehow learns that Clive was Ifrit and was the reason he almost died. He could have also come to think that maybe Clive was the one behind the plot of their father's assassination instead of their mother. That sounds way more intriguing and creates a conflict that must be resolved that is centered around a character's feelings. It also probably forces them to confront their mom on the assassination plot thing. But the entire thing is never really brought up between the two of them. There's basically zero conflict. Instead, Joshua just shows up out of nowhere like Mickey Mouse in Kingdom Hearts to save his brother. Again, it feels like Joshua is permanently on the run like Bran, but has no reason to be. Pretty much no one should be able to recognize him, and everyone also thinks that he died 18 years ago. But somehow Benedicta captures him and realizes that he's important. And it never gets mentioned as to how or why. What was she even planning to do with him? This is all to say that the plot of 16 feels contrived, like everything is just a convenient coincidence to move the characters in the right direction for their story. A coincidence is not inherently bad. In fact, they can be interesting when they do have a good payoff or some explanation is later given and the result is entertaining. Yet this almost never happens in 16. For instance, how is it that the mission Clive is on just happens to be capturing his long-lost friend Jill? And on top of that, how in the world does Sid happen to show up and save them with Clive's childhood dog at just the right time? I could let maybe one or two of these go if they happened in seclusion, but the rapid-fire succession of these coincidences all happening one after the other is way too much, and even worse is that none of them are ever explained. So what then was even the point of the time skip? Why not just have Clive and Jill escape together somehow and find Sid instead of putting our hero in grave danger? Just so you can bail them out with the power of coincidental plot armor? Even though these coincidences are bad, they still could have been explained to give an interesting payoff. We could have gotten some background on Sid, and maybe somehow learned that he knew you were on that mission and purposely went to intervene, like he's been looking for you on purpose instead of just happening to run into you. That alone would have made it feel a lot more real, and then we're just left with Jill and the dog, and that's more acceptable. There's a ton of ways they could have gone about this, but they decided to just leave it at a total coincidence instead. Things like this give me pause and have me constantly questioning what the heck was Square trying to do at all. For example, there's a short intermission during the first Mother Crystal infiltration mission where we are given a cutscene and each of our party members are jumping over a gap in a broken bridge. Clive and Jill make it over just fine, but Sid struggles and almost falls through and dies. Luckily, Clive pulls him up and saves him, and that is that, and you move on to the next section. All I could think during this was what in the world was the point of including this cutscene? Was it to foreshadow Sid's death shortly coming up? Maybe it was meant to show that he's getting weaker, or possibly to alert the audience to the dangers of jumping over a broken bridge, and give us a reason as to why we had to spend 30 minutes doing a side quest to find a carpenter to fix a broken bridge instead of just simply jumping the gap. Who's to say, but I just don't understand how this was the way they tried to foreshadow his death, but maybe that wasn't its purpose. Maybe this was just meant to be a small break in between the action to show a suspenseful moment. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if this was Square's true intention because they did the same thing in Final Fantasy VII Remake. There's a section with Aerith, Cloud, and Tifa where they're all traversing a rickety bridge over sewer water. Cloud and Tifa make it over the bridge almost effortlessly, and then comes Aerith. She struggles to hold her balance and almost falls in because something was disturbing the water. But luckily, at the last moment, Tifa grabs and pulls her over and she makes it over just fine. And when this happened, I thought the exact same thing. What the hell was the point of that? Is this Square's idea of creating a suspenseful moment? And for what purpose? Just to break up the combat and exploration sections a little? To suddenly shock the player with some random unexpectedness? At the end of the day, none of the reasoning behind why Square did it really matters. The point is that it's boring. I mean, I think it's boring largely because it feels purposeless. Not that it's impossible for purposeless things to be entertaining. I mean, people love Cookie Clicker. Anyways, back to 16, it feels like the story, after the second time skip, doesn't flow naturally with any character intention. It feels like Clive and others do things because that's what Square decided should happen. I think that this is a huge failure of the game's story, and I think if they had instead focused a lot more on Clive and his issues, both his character development and the plot would have gone in a more harmonious direction. Instead, we get a lot of dissonance with Clive's situation. Clive is seemingly unbothered by his conflicts, which doesn't make any sense to me. I think nearly any person in Clive's circumstance would have felt a lot more resentment towards their family. He would feel it towards his mother for how outwardly she showed that she finds Clive to be inferior and a stain on the family, towards his brother for becoming the Eikon while he couldn't, and also because Joshua will now inherit the throne over him because of it, and maybe even towards his father for allowing the ongoing enslavement of bears in Rosaria. Sure, post-timeskip, many of these issues might seem like they wouldn't matter that much, considering his family in Rosaria don't really exist as they once did, but I think he would still probably feel some kind of unresolved hate because of these conflicts. These kinds of things could easily leave some sort of lingering resentment that would be hard to overcome because you are never able to properly resolve them, and that's what therapy is for. Even still, there are boundless reasons for Clive to have conflict even outside of his family issues that would not feel contrived. But instead, Clive is nearly completely stoic and pushes through all of this turmoil with a sense of duty. Okay, well, that's fine. You could build up Clive's character this way, there just needs to be some kind of explanation as to how he became so stoic. But instead we get nothing. A 13-year time skip happens and he just ends up this way. But I don't think that just happens to people. Again, it just feels too unbelievable. Jill has a similar problem with her character. She was taken away from her family to be a ward of the Rosfields. Would she not then hold some amount of resentment towards her own family or even Clive's family? She then becomes a prisoner of an entirely different kingdom and is made the dominant of ice. Would this not completely fuck up a person and make them hate the world in some way? Jill has gone through so many horrible things, but she seems like a totally normal person when she's not turning into a giant ice witch. Jill is as stoic as Clive most of the time, and it's just as unbelievable. Both Clive and Jill's counterparts in Game of Thrones have a pretty similar situation, but Game of Thrones puts much more weight into their conflicts, making the characters in Game of Thrones feel more dynamic and believable. I think 16 could have even used the same exact conflicts and changed how they played out. It's fine to rehash these ideas with new characters, it happens in literally every piece of media ever. Instead, it seems like 16's version of these characters don't have any of these issues somehow, while their counterparts did. Game of Thrones makes their characters almost completely driven by their feelings and desires. In 16, it's almost the opposite, which makes these characters feel inhuman. They too often feel like emotionless husks, driven by a singular goal and nothing else around them matters. It's bizarre. In Game of Thrones, Jon Snow goes to the Wall instead of remaining in Winterfell with his family. He does this because he's technically a bastard child and has always felt a bit left out because of it. So instead of trying to fit in with the royalty of the Stark family, he chooses to serve the world by joining the Night's Watch. Sound a bit familiar to someone? But Jon is different. He doesn't do it without regret. He carries it with him to the Wall and still has to resolve his issues while he's there. It's an ongoing process that almost completely changes how Jon thinks. Clive, like Jon, seeks out what he would consider an honorable life. Surely Clive would also still hold some sort of conflicting emotions about this choice, but it's never brought up. It seems like it didn't even matter to him. I think this could be explained away, but 16 doesn't, which again makes everything feel so unbelievable. And to show you how closely similar Jon and Clive are, they also share a trait of being much more than they ever knew. Where Clive was unknowingly also a dominant of fire like his brother, and Jon Snow was secretly the true heir to the Iron Throne and possibly even a prophesized the prince that was promised, a champion sent by the god of fire. Yeah, they're both fire guys even. And they both think their brothers are dead. I wasn't joking when I said they are basically the same character. My point is that you would think that being some sort of secret god or king would affect Clive's ego in some way. It certainly does Jon's and makes him much more careless when he comes back from the dead. On the other hand, Clive seems totally unaffected. The only conflict that really comes up is that he can't use his power whenever he would like. But even that gets resolved in the most boring way possible. It just happens. There's no build-up, it just finally happens when most convenient. It seems the only conflict Clive ever truly confronts is that he was potentially responsible for his brother's death. Then we never hear of this problem ever again. Meanwhile, Jon is constantly struggling with these same issues. Like when he was chosen to be the steward over a ranger. Jon wanted to be a ranger because he's a great fighter, but is instead tasked as a steward who mostly do desk work and random boring chores. It certainly hurts him a lot and he has to find a way to accept it. At every single turn in Game of Thrones, there is some kind of interesting conflict. A decision needs to be made and is largely decided by what is correct for the character rather than being contrived for the overall plot. This often puts character development and plot working in harmony with each other. For example, there comes a moment where Jon learns his father has been executed and his brother has started a war because of it. So now Jon has to decide between helping his brother and family in the war or sticking with his honorable choice of serving the realm and the Night's Watch. Obviously, this is an incredibly difficult decision for him, but this kind of conflict brings out the best of Jon's character and helps you learn exactly who Jon is. and his choice to stay with the Night's Watch ultimately makes sense for the plot and his character.
Honor made you leave. Honor brought you back.
My friends brought me back.
I didn't say it was your honor.
In 16, Clive is almost never given a conflict where he must make a decision. And when it does happen, it almost never feels justified through his character and feels like it just goes in the direction the plot has pushed him towards. One of the only times where I remotely felt like Clive made a decision that made sense for both the plot and his character was to go kill Titan. Outside of that, the lack of conflict and decisions means we don't really get to learn who Clive is. Though maybe this could have been resolved a little more if the characters would question anything. I think maybe one of the most insane things that happens in this game is that Torgal, Clive's childhood wolf dog thing, just finds his way back to him, and no one questions it or says a word about it.
Torgal.
Aye?
His name is Torgal.
You two acquainted?
There is a small side quest that talks about how Torgal was always looking for Clive ever since he left for Phoenix Gate, but it hardly explains anything beyond that. Both Clive and Jill have basically little to no reaction or questions about how in the world Torgal just happened to end up with Sid. It's almost a recurring theme in this game. Events that would be considered pretty crazy in almost any context will happen, and then it's given little to no thought or reaction.
Mother.
It's just so unbelievable. I mean, people freak out over the littlest things in real life, like flipping a water bottle onto a table.
The sun's still out.
Then someone's dog shows up after 13 years and they're just like, glad to have you back, buddy. What kind of psycho shit is that? I'll say it, I'm still so salty they killed off Sid. Not only because he's a good character, but the game would have been so much more tolerable with him around. That just feels like it was just another contrived coincidence where Clive was randomly put in danger and then bailed out from plot armor. It felt like the only point of Sid dying was so Clive could run around the hideout and do boring side quests, and give Clive lightning powers. All I know is that the story would have been much more enjoyable if they had just kept Sid around, or actually made Clive and Jill feel like real people that would actually engage and act around their feelings and emotions. Speaking of characters with zero emotion, Ultima, in my opinion, makes every other villain feel pointless. I get that he's meant to be like the Night King from Game of Thrones. I mean, Ultima even starts building up his own army of the undead. These similarities are truly uncanny. But the thing is that even the Night King hardly even served the plot of Game of Thrones well. In the end, it barely mattered, and it was mostly just a way to keep Jon Snow away, and give some truth to the rumors of winter is coming, I guess. In 16, they've set up this entire political landscape, yet Ultima was secretly controlling everyone else the entire time, which is what makes all of it just feel irrelevant in the end. It feels like these characters could have played bigger roles and acted on their own, but instead Ultima was the only real threat. So what's the point of having any sort of political landscape set up at all? I will say the Ultima fight was pretty cool, but it wasn't cool because we were fighting Ultima, it could have been anyone. So again, I have to wonder, why favor all of these ridiculous plot points over lifting up the characters you've created? Why not build a plot around the relationships between these interesting characters instead of focusing on something as dull as Ultima? Don't know how many times I'm going to say this, but Sid was a great character, maybe even one of the best Final Fantasy has ever had. And then less than a fourth of the way through the story, they just kill him so they can say, look, we killed off our good character too, just like Game of Thrones. But if you only have one good character, why would you have them die? They should have just killed Joshua a second time and it had us wondering if he was going to be alive again. Now that might have been good. But there's just no justification for Sid's death. Clive doesn't need to be the hideaway leader for the story to work. There doesn't need to be a time skip. Basically nothing happens in those 5 years anyways except that they move locations. Wouldn't it have been more interesting to have Clive be Sid's right-hand man for longer so he can actually learn to lead and understand how to make the tough decisions? Or are they just trying to copy Game of Thrones again, where the leader of the Night Watch dies and Jon wins the vote to take over as an unexperienced leader? This could have been an interesting angle to take, but again, Clive is never faced with any kind of actual difficult decisions about the hideaway. Everything is basically hunky-dory there all the time. Bringing us back to Sid again, would it not have been a more fitting ending for Sid to die to Titan? I feel like something like this could have been a far better conclusion to the story of Benedicta, Sid, and Titan. You could even have this sad scene where Sid is dying and he asks Clive to not think about revenge and to please instead take care of the hideaway. And then Jon Snow is sitting there saying, I don't want it, I never wanted it. Just like he never wanted to be the Eikon. He just wanted to protect it. And then Clive goes into a rage and then starts to fight with Titan. Oh man, wouldn't that have been a way better and a way more poetic way to go about it? I mean, if you're going to copy Game of Thrones, just do it more directly, and at the least, copy the good parts instead of the freaking Night King of all things. Even worse than that, at the end of it all, Clive dies from the curse that bears get after using magic for too long, even though he never ever showed any symptoms of the curse. Meanwhile, everyone else is coughing their brains out after using a sprinkle of snow or lightning, and Clive just keeps on moving on like a normal person, after turning into a wind tornado, a fire tornado, and a giant beam of light that blasts enemies in the face for a whole minute. The idea of Clive dying this way is a bit sadly romantic, but it doesn't feel deserved. The story given to us until this point doesn't give it any credibility. I mean, maybe Ultimate being around was the reason why he wasn't affected by the curse, but that doesn't feel like it resolves it correctly either. I don't care how much Clive or Jill cried at the end, I really don't think it was a good way for Clive to die. I don't mind if they want Clive to die at the end, but it can't be like that. This only reminds me again that this is a game that actually put somewhat interesting villains into their story with varying backgrounds and relationships, but then they kill every single one of them before they can do anything, and the ones they don't are just Ultima's puppets. So then you're left with just the most mundane villain who has no morals or emotion. I mean, I know it's a Final Fantasy game and we have to kill the gods, but that doesn't mean they can't make it interesting. Just have one of the other villains turn into a god or something. They do this in Final Fantasy X with Sin and Jet, and it makes it feel so much more meaningful. Maybe make it so Clive is the god we have to kill instead. Why not just make Clive a Daenerys where he says fuck it and teams up with Ultima to try to end it all? And then you have to play the fight as Joshua and team up with all the villains and Renly to try and stop him. So at the end of it all, it was Joshua that needed to kill Clive instead of Clive needing to kill Joshua. I mean, would that not have been the most absolutely tragically romantic thing possible? They had all the setup right there to do something awesome like this. They even put it in the lore already that Ifrit is meant to be a god above the rest. Although I probably would have been a little conflicted in killing Clive, but at least I would have thought it was cool. I think we can bring this back around to the idea that Square just didn't include any of the context correctly. There's a lot of interesting setup for these characters, the plot, and even some of the world, but none of it gets used. It's like they completely forgot where these characters came from and how they got here. And when every single major plot event happens, it's like none of it ever even mattered. We can take a closer look at the missions to break the Mother Crystals as a clear example of this. Despite being the main focus of the plot, these two feel completely coincidental. How is it that we end up breaking the Mother Crystal at Renly's place at the same time that the whole coup with Renly and his dad is happening? Although I'm willing to forgive this one a little because it did give us a good excuse to have a fight with Bahamut, but surely there was a better way. And what about the Tian fight? The purpose of going there had nothing to do with the Mother Crystal. Clive was just pissed off at Tian for trying to kill Jill. Fair, admittedly, and one of the few times we actually get to see Clive do something that makes sense for his character. But then we just happen to kill the Mother Crystal at the end of it. The core is just conveniently out and open for us to smash after the fight, which is pretty nice. I mean, obviously we might as well do it while we're here. We did come all this way. It just feels like it came out of nowhere, as if the main quest of the game was just an afterthought instead of the focus. This feels like the perfect way to sum up the problems with how Final Fantasy XVI progresses. Things that should have been more of a focus, such as character development, take a backseat to whatever side character needs a part to fix their ship. Somehow worse than the bad character development, plot, or rubber noises are the RPG systems placed into this game. In fact, I don't think you can even consider these RPG systems. They're hardly even a good illusion of a system. Even the newest players to the genre will realize that these upgrades to your weapons and armor lack any meaning or choice. Here's what happens. Every time you finish the next main quest scenario, there's usually new stuff to buy in the shop. Typically, this is just a singular choice. There's one new weapon and a couple armor pieces. All of their stats are higher than whatever you currently had. And even if you run past half the monsters in this game, you'll have enough materials to buy this weapon and its upgrade. There's no choice to make. This all simply amounts to a boring dialogue sequence you have to go through after each main quest. On top of this, there are also stats you get for leveling, but again, there is no choice involved. There's a lot of different stats in the game according to the level up screen, but they don't matter at all. So your damage and defense is only directly related to your level and the gear you have on. They could have totally removed stats from the game and it wouldn't feel any different. The only time my level had any effect on me was when I was hunting a boss that was like 13 levels higher than me, which was actually probably the most fun I had while playing the game. Lastly, there are some accessories which actually do offer some choice in how you play the game, although it's severely lacking. And there's a ring that is so good that it basically takes away an accessory slot, because it's tough to imagine why anyone would choose to not use the Berserker ring after you get it. It just makes the game way more fun. Which then I have to wonder, why even make it an accessory option? Doesn't this just make more sense to exist as a talent instead? Somewhere within Clive's base tree, perhaps? It's great that Square decided to make an accessory that actually impacts how you play the game, but it would be nice if there was more than one, or if they just expanded the talent system a little more. Here's my point. RPGs have choice. That's, for the most part, what an RPG comes down to. And Final Fantasy XVI has next to no choice compared to any game that I would be willing to categorize as an RPG. There's not even fake dialogue choices, so I don't understand what the point of attempting to disguise this game as an RPG is, other maybe than trying to cater to people who expect it. But if you're going to make the system this bare bones and useless, those same people are going to just be upset and or confused. This is probably going to sound flimsy at best, but I do find it to be true. Square succeeds when they give these games the soul of a Final Fantasy game, and what makes a game Final Fantasy-like is a hotly debated topic, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there is something about how this series is made that makes them feel a certain way, because despite every Final Fantasy game being more different than the last, there is a common thread and feeling between all of them. It's easy to get misled that this common thread is that there's a story centered around a few characters that you travel the world with and end up slaying the gods or people in power. Even though, yeah, honestly, that's a lot of what Final Fantasy games come down to. Even Final Fantasy XVI is included in this, but something is still missing. You might then think maybe it's a vibe check. Final Fantasy games are typically a bit less serious and a little more goofy with their characters. Personally, I felt this feeling existing in 16 before Sid died, but afterwards Clive spends far too much time by himself and the amount of interaction and dialogue you get with important characters sort of fizzles out into nothing between each major plot event. Meanwhile, in every other Final Fantasy game outside of the start, you are almost always in a party with other characters who are reacting to the current situation, giving input, and asking for help with their problems. This also gives the characters time to goof off and just be actual characters in a story. 16 can feel much like the opposite, where we are the main character in an MMO trying to solve everyone's problems while learning nothing about our own. But at the end of the day, while this kind of vibe is pretty typical of Final Fantasy games, I don't think it's what foundationally sets it apart from other games or genres. Even though I would prefer Square keep the series in their usual kind of vibe, not only because it's what people expect, but I just kind of like the goofiness and ridiculousness of it all. Cock and balls. But it goes even deeper than that. I think 16 could feel Final Fantasy-like even without this vibe check. When I first realized 16 wasn't Final Fantasy-like, I wanted to say that it should have been called a different name, unrelated to this series. That way they can experiment with this new style without feeling the need to keep any sort of expectations. Even though Final Fantasy is always changing, these changes felt as if they were unprecedented. Mostly because previous evolutions usually pertain mostly to the gameplay rather than the storytelling. The presentation of the story has certainly seen massive changes throughout the span of Final Fantasy games, from the Super Nintendo to the PlayStation to what we have now. But between all the different generations, the storytelling and the plot structure has mostly stayed the same. And until recently, I believe that was the one constant throughout the series. It's what I used to attribute so much of its success towards. Creating an interactive story and world that's fun to play. But 16 has made me realize this is not the constant between Final Fantasy games. There's something even more foundationally true of a typical Final Fantasy game. Somehow I'm always brought back to 13 with my realizations around the series. Maybe it's because so many have said that 13 changes everything about what Final Fantasy games could be, or should be. But the one thing that keeps it Final Fantasy-like to me is simply that it's an RPG. Of course, it's not only that it's an RPG that makes it Final Fantasy-like, but it is the core part of what makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy-like. To me, 16 feels like Square is attempting to make a pizza without bread, and then trying to tell me it's pizza. While I've probably made it clear by now that I loathe the story of 16, I don't necessarily have a problem with the mechanics through which the story of 16 is told, despite it not feeling very Final Fantasy-like, because it comes down to the execution of it more than anything else. I think a Final Fantasy game could still be successful telling this kind of story. A story focused around a single main character. I just don't think Square got it right this time. Again, Final Fantasy games are always iterating and looking to push the envelope, but the problem is this was always within the idea of what a JRPG could be. I don't think you can even consider 16 to be an RPG, let alone a JRPG. Again, bringing back the pizza, you can put whatever the hell you want on your pizza and people will still call it pizza, as long as you've made the foundation with some sort of bread in a pizza shape. But it feels like Square Enix put cheese, onions, and tomatoes into a taco shell and tried to convince us it was pizza. So being a JRPG is the only true constant that ties every Final Fantasy game together until now. But 16 is undeniably an action game masquerading as an RPG. This game even has the option for you to play it like it's a button mashing hack and slash. The only element that I would even consider RPG-like would be Clive's talent tree, but if every game that has a story and a talent tree is an RPG, then we probably need a better definition. I won't even attempt to rehash what a JRPG is here, but JRPGs are not simply RPGs made in Japan. And if you need something that's more in-depth to understand this, please watch Never Knows Best video on what a JRPG is. Otherwise, you'll just have to trust me for now that Final Fantasy games are of the JRPG variety. I don't know how true this is, but it feels like this game was made to be catered towards a certain audience instead of making something they thought would be good. And if Square has ever done something right, it was that they almost always tried to make a game they thought was good, reception be damned. They were always iterating and innovating. While 16 certainly feels like it pushes boundaries during its highs, the other 90% of the game feels like it's doing its best to hide the fact that it's some kind of action Game of Thrones MMO in disguise. But I don't think it's a fair judgment for me to say that Square isn't trying to innovate their series. If I had to guess, I would think they got lost somewhere trying to make an action RPG and it ended up as an action game instead. Still, I'm not going to pretend like I know what's happening in that game studio. I can only comment on what the finished product ended up as. I can only hope that future Final Fantasies will come back to having more emphasis on what they tend to do best, which is characters, story, and RPGs. But now I'm going to flip on you. While I still do believe that, if 16 had been designed to be a true RPG, it would have been a better experience, it's ultimately not the reason why I found so much of 16 to be so boring. It truly doesn't matter whether or not 16 was a Final Fantasy-like or an RPG or not. The only thing that did matter was whether or not the game was good. And ultimately, the core problem is still that the characters, story, and questing was so horribly boring after the second time skip that I dreaded playing through anything that wasn't the main quest scenario. In fact, if those other parts of the game were fun, I probably wouldn't be here talking about the game at all. My point is that it wasn't necessary for 16 to be a JRPG for it to be good, but it probably would have been more likely to lead them in the right direction. Anyways, that's my 2 cents on that, or our. Ultimately, I think I've made my thoughts on 16 clear. And while some parts of this game are unbelievably great, far more are disastrously bad. It's tough to say whether or not making 16 more of a JRPG would fix this issue. But certainly if they had crafted the plot more carefully with the context of each character in the world in mind, it likely would have been much better. It's tough for me to consider 16 to be a Final Fantasy-like game, but if more of the game had actually been fun and interesting, I might not have ever even mentioned it or cared. If Final Fantasy 17 is a great puzzle game, I probably won't care too much that it's called Final Fantasy, although I'll probably still mention it. The only thing I truly care about is Square creating good experiences. And if I had to judge an experience by whether or not I would enjoy having it again, 16 would be near the bottom of the list. I never want to play it again. I usually play games twice through for good measure. I couldn't bring myself to do it for this one. Although I almost had to because my drive somehow deleted all my footage, but luckily I was able to recover most of it. Anyways, all I can hope for is that Square learns from their mistakes and continue to try and make better games. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.